Thanks very much, Tracy. And it's a great privilege for me as the Chair of Board of Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Australia New Zealand to welcome you here tonight to hear the inspiring stories for a truly wonderful Australian, Kerrie Atherton. I'm going to let Kerrie do most of the talking tonight because I know she's inspirational and I hope she'll inspire many of you to be fearless if you are having to deal with your own mental health issues and post-traumatic stress. Before I get going, I'd like to welcome any members of the First Australian community to this webinar and say how welcome you are to be participating with us today. And secondly, to say I was a little disappointed that Cyclone Alfred decided that we couldn't do this in advance of International Women's Day, because to be brutally honest about it, that would have given us a real look into what was going to take place on the Saturday. But I know people living up in the Sunshine Coast, on the Gold Coast and around Brisbane and up to Hervey Bay and down to Coffs Harbour were all dealing with their own sets of issues last Saturday. So maybe luck prevailed in this case. I'd also like to say to people, it's over 10 years till we established PTSD, Australia, New Zealand and Fearless Outreach. And I know that this year is going to be quite exciting because at board level, we're undergoing a process of change to make those changes we think are necessary to adapt to a new environment and to be more effective at what we've been trying to do. Nonetheless, our core principles remain the same. We are here to help people who live with post-traumatic stress disorder, whether you are a sufferer or whether you live with people who are sufferers, or whether you work with people who are sufferers. So we're here for all of you. We do not prescribe any particular treatments and we don't recommend specialists to go and see. What we do say is have a relationship with a trusted GP and go and get the best help you can for yourself, because that's being fearless in approaching the problems you need to deal with and being able to deal with them adequately. The second thing I wanted to just talk about for a minute is the new environment that we're now living with. I'm sure many of you may be worried about what's happening in the United States of America and what that means for countries like ours. I want to make a couple of points about that because I'm very involved in thinking about these issues myself. First of all, only the Americans can sort out their problem. It's not something we can sort out here in Australia. But you might want to think we're lucky enough not to have a land border with the United States in today's world. Secondly, I think that the new president in America, we need to look at actions rather than words. Unfortunately, a lot of our media reporting is about words and not actions. And I think it's very confronting many times. I'm asking you to think carefully about it because it's easy to be taken down by some of these things. And thirdly, just to let you know what I'm working on today, some of you may have read in the press about me talking about Australia's new strategic environment, and that's an issue that's going to take up my time over the next few months. The second issue that I'm working on is climate change and what that means for communities all over Australia. And those of you that have been through Cyclone Alfred know what I'm talking about. And I'm seeing a reluctance by governments and political parties to go and talk to communities. And I know that a lot of communities are hurting because of these things that have been happening to them. And finally, I'm not going to give up working on mental health issues and how they affect Australians. But we are very lucky in this country because we're only a small number of people effectively. And secondly, we also have some very advanced scientists and researchers and treatment specialists in this country who are second to none. There are people in this country working on becoming the world's gold standard. And that is another reason for us to be fearless when we're dealing with our own mental health issues or we are trying to help people who have them and they need our support. Now, I'm really excited by this particular webinar because I've heard Kerrie speak before, and I know that her story is inspirational. She's representative of a number of Australians who do not take no for an answer when they figure out something needs to get done. And I know that if you haven't heard her story before, you'll be truly impressed. So without any further ado, I want to invite Kerrie now to talk to you about her story, why she now runs Empowered Lives and Stories of Hope, and how she got there from being at the bottom of the pit to the heights that she's now ascended to. Kerrie, it's your show.
Thanks, Chris. And it's exciting to hear about all the things that you're doing and the great impact you're making in this world. I am one of those people in Australia who struggles with mental health. And for me, it all began in childhood. I can remember as far back as preschool, really, feeling like I never fitted into this world. And I had this sense of feeling like I was an alien with two heads. I thought everyone was staring at me everywhere I went, and I felt like a raw, exposed nerve. I grew up in a home with two alcoholic parents and very loving parents, but it was one where I often couldn't predict the atmosphere. And I carried a lot of shame for that. And often children of alcoholics do carry this invisible veil of shame. Then, when I was 7 years old, it was just another average afternoon when I was walking to the laundry to ask my mum for my favourite purple dress. And I heard her scream. And I saw her shaking violently attached to the washing machine. And she was being electrocuted. And absolute terror set in for me that day that I would never see my mum again. I now know that she actually had died and come back to life in that moment. And we were taken to the neighbour's house. And I didn't think that I would ever see her again. But the next day, she came home from hospital with two scars up both wrists about that big. And she'd had a full electric shock that went right through her body and came out the other side. And she was never really the same from that day on. She struggled emotionally. She struggled with deep depression. And she drank at night when I was asleep. She never drank when I was awake. But my dad was also a recovering alcoholic after watching both his parents die of alcoholism in their 40s and 50s. And so he stopped drinking before I was born and was determined that he was not going to put his own children through the horror and trauma that he'd been through. After that event at 7, I had another couple of very traumatic events, and one at 9 involved being sexually assaulted by a pedophile while on holidays. And I came back from that holiday with the knowledge that the person that had assaulted me had our address, and it turned out to be the son of one of the owner of the holiday cabins. My parents had taken us to the police, and the police did nothing. They basically said it's your daughter's story against his, and they also insinuated to my parents that they knew this guy, they knew that he'd done this before, but they didn't know if there'd be any justice for me. And they said, it's too traumatic for your 9-year-old daughter, take her home. Going home with me that day after was more shame and an absolutely terrifying fear that this person, because we'd been to the police, would track me down and kill me having our address. I was also being bullied at school at the same time. And at 10 years old, my mum found me under the bed one night and I'd had a nervous breakdown. I was taken to the family psychiatrist and prescribed anti-anxiety medication and antidepressants. And I actually asked my mum in adulthood, why did you put me on medication? And she said, because we feared that you might end your life at that young age had you not been on medication. So then when I turned 15, I actually discovered alcohol for the first time. And despite knowing that my parents had had a struggle with alcoholism, I was just so curious to see whether alcohol would ease the terrifying thoughts that I had inside my head, the self-hatred. And so I had my first drink, and it was actually a cask of wine that had been hidden under the caravan across the road, and it was boiling hot. And I drank almost the whole cask at once. I was violently ill, but for the first time in my life, I felt normal. And this is something that we often hear in the rooms of AA, that alcohol coloured us in. And I thought this was my answer. Something a lot of people don't realise is that people that have been through trauma turn to substances as a way of escape. Alcohol, they drink their feelings. Substances, they ingest their feelings. Food, they eat their feelings. Gambling, they gamble their feelings away. But what happens on those journeys of addiction is a whole nother level and layers of trauma that start to set in as a result of what happens on the journey. So when the person comes to rock bottom, there is just a lot of vicarious trauma to deal with and to try and heal. That rock bottom was my second rock bottom at 18, after I spiraled downhill very, very quickly. And I was suicidal for a long time after being in a domestic violent relationship where I was punched in front of families at a caravan park while on holidays. I returned and I had absolutely lost the will to live. It was more that I didn't know how to live anymore. I knew that AA was there. I knew that I had a loving family, but I just didn't know how to do it anymore. And I planned to end my life. And right at that moment, I heard a loud voice say, "Don't do it. If you hang on a bit longer, you'll find happiness one day." And I called AA and I went to a meeting that night. And I've been fortunate enough not to pick up a drink of alcohol or a mood-changing drug because I had become addicted to those pills that I was prescribed and I would abuse them. And that's been 43 years now. And something that I know a lot about is resilience, because to be able to stay sober in the midst of what was to come next in my life is something that I still don't understand myself. But having learnt this level of resilience, I think by my parents and other people that I've come in contact with, that has actually enabled me to retain a level of resilience that I personally never thought possible. So everything seemed to be going quite well after that. I met my husband and I had went on to have two amazing children, and they're wonderful human beings who don't struggle with addictions today. I've broken that cycle, which is fantastic. And everything seemed to be going quite well, you know, compared to the life that I'd had and what I'd been through. But then 40, the age of 40 came and everything changed. Even though I'd battled depression throughout the years, I'd never really acknowledged it as being that because life seemed good compared to what it was. But 40 was the start of a 13-year spiral into grief. And it started when I moved to the Sunshine Coast with my husband and two children. I left everything, my security network, down in Sydney. I left my mum and dad and my brothers, and we were a very, very close family. I left all my friends, my AA community, my job, my wider community, which I was very active in, and I moved up to Queensland to absolutely nothing. And when I told my mum that we were moving, she was absolutely devastated. And I moved up here with a terrible conviction that I was responsible for destroying my parents' life. And it was something that I would carry for a long time. And a year and a half later, my mum was diagnosed with cancer. She had a 4-year battle, but in the middle of all that time, a year before she went into palliative care, my uncle tragically died and he was 49 years old. My mum was in palliative care for 11 months in Sydney, and I was living in Queensland. 3 months before she died, my daughter was due to get married, and 3 weeks before that, my husband had a terrible accident and broke his collarbone in 5 places. My daughter then got married. She was 20, so she left the family home, and that again was another traumatic event. Empty nest syndrome, too close to losing, knowing that I was losing my mum also. And not long after my mum died, my cousin was killed in a motorbike accident. I lost both my grandparents, I lost aunties and uncles, and my dad was diagnosed with last stages of emphysema. And I knew what barrel I was staring down again, the same barrel that I had looked at and stared down with my mum's illness. And so for another 3 years after that was spent back and forth to Sydney, visiting my dad in and out of hospital. When my dad passed away just over 8 years ago, my husband had a breakdown and then was diagnosed with osteoporosis and told that he had the bones of an 85-year-old. My dog of 16 years became very sick and had to be put down. And then my son, whom I'm extremely close to, moved to Sydney to pursue a career. And I was faced with the empty nest syndrome in the middle of all the other grief and trauma that I had gone through, and I felt totally alone. And because I was a counsellor, because I worked in the community up here, because I was a leader in different areas of my life, there seemed to be this perception that I didn't need any help. And in my darkest hour, my darkest weeks, my darkest time, I hardly had anybody check in to see if I was okay. I locked myself away for around 6 weeks, and that in itself is a real warning sign for anybody out there. If somebody checks out of their regular activities, something's very wrong. But I knew that I was in grave danger mentally, and that if I didn't do something quickly, that I would drink again, because that was what I was thinking about doing after 35 years, sober. So I went to a women's conference, and in that women's conference, I heard 3 people share their stories of coming out the other side of hard times. And I cried through the whole thing. But in that moment, I had a light bulb moment in that conference. And that was that even though I hadn't been able to find a person who truly understood the level of trauma and pain that I had been through, that I would become that person for others. And I had overcome so much in my life, and I knew it, and I knew that I had stories to share that could bring hope to others. And I decided that my pain will not be in vain, but I will use it for others' gain. And I knew that I knew a lot of other people as well that had fantastic stories of resilience. And we were people that had gone from being the victim to being the victor. And so that's where Stories of Hope began. And so I started gathering people, gathering speakers, and I started putting community events on for my local community with 2 speakers every single month. I put this on free for the community for 5 years. And that's where a wonderful ripple effect, community, care, connection, and purpose began. And it was that purpose that really pulled me out and saved my life. So I might pause there, Chris, in case you have any questions at this stage, or I'm cautious of time. You unmute.
Thanks, Kerrie. That was a good scene setter, and I hope it will inspire some people to ask questions of you. But, going through a number of things resonated with me. One of them being about the importance of our personal relationships and being open to each other in the sense of really being able to talk about what's going on inside our heads or in our hearts with people who are close to us. And I think the second thing, and I'm really interested in this part, would be now that you've been sharing stories with other people and you've been hearing other people's stories. And I'm just wondering now, with all of that experience, have you developed certain approaches to being able to help people and how to suggest to them what to do next and what are the kinds of things they need to be thinking about and those kinds of issues? So are there any tools, for example, out there that people can use? Because we used to talk about the toolbox in dealing
Yeah.
with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, well, I never just presume, though, that the approaches that I use with some people will be right for everyone. I think the most important thing about working with people that have been through vicarious trauma, and as I have named my experience is now, I've put a label on it, and it's a trauma trigger tsunami. So it's when one trauma happens on top of another, and this stuff just stays buried. But I think the most important thing is building a connection with people, no matter who we are. We all have the ability to build a connection with someone. And we all have a story in our life that can help pull someone else out of a hard time. But it's building a space as well where people feel safe and not judged. A lot of the people that come to me have struggled with addictions and a tremendous amount of shame. And I think the most important thing is holding space where they feel heard and that they know that despite what they tell me, despite what they've done or despite what's happened to them, that once they tell me that and open up about that, that they have the knowledge that they're still loved and accepted. And I think that's something that's vitally important for anybody who is offering a listening ear to another person. One of the things that I do with my counselling and coaching clients is I try to help them identify triggers. And I do a lot of work with cognitive behaviour therapy. A lot of people, though, when I ask them and say, do you know what your triggers are? They actually don't know or they can't identify them. So a tool that I use, I ask them a simple question and I draw a box and I say, what makes you feel sad? What makes you feel anxious or fearful? And what makes you feel either frustrated, angry? And they can easily list that. That's something people can identify with. And once they can list those things, they've identified their triggers. So CBT is one of the main tools that I use, but I'm aware that with around 35% of people struggling with PTSD that CBT doesn't work. So I'm in collaboration with, a lot of other people in the field who offer alternate therapies that I can encourage my clients to just have a conversation about and explore what's right for them. Some of those things could be medication. There's ketamine trials out now, EMDR, ECT treatment. I encourage all the clients that come to me for addictions to attend a 12-step meeting with an open mind to look for the similarities and not the differences. In some cases, that may involve also for healing and recovery for people to move away from their old environment and people that might not have had a positive influence or impact in their life. But I think the greatest thing really is connection and purpose. And I hear this over and over and over again. Because when we are disconnected, which seems to be a thing where when people are struggling mentally, they isolate and disconnect. But what happens then is we're left with those lies and those negative tapes and those negative voices that have been going on in our heads for so long. And with around 60,000 thoughts a day, with 80% of them being negative and 95% being repetitive, those thoughts, It's a dangerous place to be in. So I encourage people, just talk to someone, connect with someone, even if that's a helpline, like Lifeline or something like that, but try and find somebody that you trust. And just things like self-care, keeping in balance. For me, it's getting out for a walk, playing the piano, catching up with my girlfriends, looking at the ocean, watching Netflix, uh, and simple things that bring joy to our senses.
That's an interesting idea about the senses, and just picking up on all of those things you just mentioned and how each of them has a relevance to a particular sense. And, I'm sure there'll be people here whose senses may be dulled, and it's worth thinking about how can you re-enliven those kinds of things. I want to turn now and talk about this idea of hope, because it seems to me that as human beings, um, all of us have this element in our makeup of being hopeful about things or looking for hope or things, and it's one of the reasons why I mentioned what's going on in the United States right now, because I don't want people to feel that we don't have some answers. I think we do have some answers. The fact is, we just got to get ourselves together and get sorted. But on the stories of hope, and you will have heard over 5 years or more, lots and lots of stories about people whose hope was fundamental as a building block, whose hope, and even in your own case, hope was sometimes um, uh, destroyed a little bit, rebuilding hope when that happens to you, and this whole question of resilience that we need to exploit if we're going to deal successfully with our issues. And the one thing that just sprang out to me a minute ago was this sense of self-worth, that we are all worth something, we all have talents,
Yeah.
all have contributions we can make for other people. For people who may be feeling that there is no self-worth, that's a really important aspect that has to be worked on, surely. So can you just tell us from stories of hope how you see that dimension?
Yeah, and when you were just thinking, it led me to something that I meant to talk about before. With the birthing of stories of hope, what that's all about for me, and I think that this is a life-saving and life-giving factor, is the ability in the middle of our pain to serve other people. So, it's becoming others-centered and less self-centered. Whenever we can focus on somebody else, our mind is off ourselves. It's off our troubles, and it's on what we can do for someone else. And if people can't even fathom a purpose, that small thing in itself, which has a multitude and a ripple effect, really has the ability to be a massive purpose for the person that feels like they've actually got nothing to give and no hope. We all have the ability to care about someone. We all have the ability to show empathy. And even in the middle of our pain, we all have that ability. Um,
So helping others seems to encapsulate the idea here. It doesn't matter whether it's one person or a whole group of people. But if I looked at let's say the people that we have in the Fearless organisation, there is a common denominator with the members of the board and the ambassadors, and that is they are helping other people.
yeah, absolutely.
And I think for all of us, that's been very positive. And so I'd be interested if there are other people on this webinar who have those kinds of stories that they'd like to put up so we can hear about them either now or even in the days to come. So we've just passed International Women's Day.
Yeah.
And I think the theme for this year's International Women's Day was accelerating action. I wondered if you had any thoughts about that theme and how it resonates with the women in our communities. I mean, I happen to think that most women in Australia are in a luckier situation than many of the women that I met when I was working in India, for example. So better possibilities, better opportunities, and so on and so forth. But just to reflect on that accelerating action and the realisation that even though we've talked about it a lot, we actually haven't been able to achieve it in life's reality.
Yeah, I think that by continuing to speak up and champion what we believe, that's the key to change. Continuing to show up and be authentic and vulnerable gives other people permission to do that and other women to do that. It's a sensitive topic, isn't it, in today's society? And I'm also mindful of the fact that we have some of these dictators on social media now that are creating a terrible narrative about how to treat women and what the typical male should be like.
Mm.
As a woman, this is an interesting thing here, Chris, because I grew up in a man's world. And I've encountered some real bullies and perpetrators in my life, but in general, I have had more supportive men around me. So as a woman, I've never really felt that I've had to push very hard to be heard or be accepted. But one thing, I do a lot of work with men's mental health, and one thing that on the back of that I'm hearing a lot is men coming forward feeling very discouraged in today's society because of this narrative that's being put out there about this toxic masculinity narrative that's been put out there about what men should be like. And so much talk about domestic violence. A lot of men are actually struggling. The good men in our world are struggling because they feel like they've been shoved into that same box.
Mm.
So, I actually, as a woman, I speak up about a few things, and I speak up about that sexual assault can happen to anyone, abuse can happen to anyone. But one message in particular that is close to my heart as a woman, and I know there's a lot of supportive men out here who really care for women in this area, is sexual violence against girls and women.
Yeah.
And one message as a woman, especially, in line with International Women's Day, that I would like to get out there is that if you have been a victim of sexual assault or sexual violence, to please speak to someone.
Yeah. Look, I
It
think.
happened to me when I was 17 and I told no one, and I
Mm.
carried it for so long, and I think I was held back for so long because of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I met a lot of young women in the Navy when I was leading the charge to make it all right for women to go to sea who had similar experiences. And to be honest about it, I think it took them down. It destroyed their careers. A lot of them kept the stories to themselves. It was really like trying to open a tin with a blunt tin opener to get the stories out of these people, and it required a lot of work to first of all recognise that somebody had a problem, but they weren't going to talk about it, and then spending some time with them to create an environment when they'd have the confidence to tell you what really happened. But the next step was the hardest, and that is you cannot just keep this to yourself because the predators nearly always have a track record. And if you don't know what's been going on, it's very hard to eliminate them from our society. Now, I also know that our police forces haven't always dealt with these things properly and sensitively. In the workplaces, we haven't always dealt with it properly, and the whole issue of unacceptable behaviour. And I don't know whether anyone would like to recall our first national conversation. You may remember our present Governor General spoke to that conference about domestic violence.
Yeah.
And when I was, she was with me and walking out, and she said to me, I've got daughters and I worry a lot about what I should tell them about men.
Yeah.
And so, at all levels in our society, we have these issues. There is a pushback against what they call the woke society now, and let's go back to the old days, blah, blah, blah. And I think it is important for our men and for our women to stand up and make sure we don't walk back. We've got to move ahead, and we've got to deal with these issues properly and give people the confidence to be able to speak openly about them.
Chris, a couple of times when I have spoken openly about the sexual assault and sexual violence, in corporate settings, I actually had quite a few people come up to me afterwards and they said, thank you, because your story was my daughter's story. Your story was my wife's story. Your story was my mother's story.
Yeah.
So I think, one thing that I don't shy away from, and it's interesting because for a very long time, I was very afraid of what people thought of me because I had such low self-esteem. And today I've learnt to like the person that's inside, and I've learnt to respect the fact that I do have a voice through the experiences that I've been through. And the day that I dealt with the rape when I was 17, I was in my 50s when I finally dealt with that. But that day that I dealt with that, I shed the shame. That was never mine to carry. And since that day, I don't fear what other people think. And if my story can help save one person from checking out and bring hope to one person so they're here tomorrow, I will stand up as a woman and I will share that. It's uncomfortable at times, but I've only ever had, and I'll say this, I've only ever had the greatest support when I do share those stories from not only women, but men also. And I think we've come a long way, with gender equality. And one example is that I've recently, in the last year, I've become the only female board member of a men's organisation called Mentoring Men Australia. And that's a wonderful board to be part of and a wonderful organisation. And I've had nothing but respect from the men on that board. And so we have come a long way in Australia.
I think our Governor General spent some time on boards like that, so you and she could probably share stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
But now I've got something on the Q&A here, Kerrie, and that is, what advice would you give to someone else who finds themselves in any one of kinds of the situations you've been through and needing help?
Speak to someone. You can't do it on your own. As much as some people might hope that they could, or the fear is too great of speaking out. As I said before, all you'll be stuck with is the negative stories and the narrative and the trauma yourself. When we go through trauma, whether it's what we call these days overt or covert, it used to be called big T and little t trauma. So big traumas were big events that happened, and little T's were traumas that happened when we were growing up. Could have been emotional neglect, just things that you normalize because you just thought, well, this is what happens in my family. And those things sometimes can go on to affect people in later life. But never minimize the trauma that's happened, because if it's something that's affected you, it's something that's affected you.
Yeah.
And speak to somebody and get help.
Would that person be inside your family or outside as a close friend or even a workmate?
And anyone. I mean, I think I think me as a counsellor, I think what people love is they just need somebody outside their circle where knows nothing about their life.
Mm.
They can open up to, and like I said, I know nobody in their circle. Uh, but it's finding the right person. Some people go and seek counselling and they don't do their homework first, or they go to the first person that their GP says, here, have a mental health plan.
Yeah.
Think it's very important to find somebody to get help from that has the lived experience as well that you have been through, because that person can truly understand the level of pain and suffering and offer that tangible hope that if they can make it, you can too.
Yes. Now, interestingly enough, at the first national conversation, which we held in Caloundra, I think the shared experience of the 3 days together led to an opening up by all sorts of people about their stories. And reflecting on it, the first half day was a bit slow, but after that, it really started to take off. And one of the reasons why I think these webinars are such a useful medium is it can create conversations, it can create some networking opportunities, it can create um, opportunities for people to share their stories with people who have similar experiences and to figure out together where to go next. So, all right. Now I've got another whiz bang question for you, Kerrie.
Yeah.
It was International Women's Day last Saturday, and you live up in an area that was badly affected by Cyclone Alfred.
Mm.
And people living between Harvey Bay and Outer Coffs Harbour all having put up with it. But what were you thinking about during that day as you were going through the need for looking after yourself and your family?
I guess the day kind of really faded into just cyclone. And every single place you turned on the news and everything, it was just negative news. I had a feeling inside that it actually wasn't going to hit us on the Sunshine Coast. But my thoughts were for making sure that my own family, as the mum of the house, that my family was safe. My kids, one set lives in a different house and one's staying with us at the moment, but just kind of making sure that they were okay. It's interesting that this, is a fearless conversation today, because something that I struggled through my entire life with was terrible amount of fear, debilitating fear. So these days I try to separate myself from too much talk about fear, too much worry about tomorrow, and really just kind of take stock of what's going on in the day.
Yes.
Because if we live in the past, we suffer with regret and the what ifs, and that leads to sadness. And if we live too far in the future, then we can be struggling with anxiety. So I actually went out and braved the storm on Saturday morning and met up with my group of girlfriends, and this is part of my self-care. And we meet up every single Saturday morning, rain, hail, or shine. And as I talked before about positive connections,
Mm.
these are girls that I love and I admire, and we become like the 5 people we spend the most time with. And so I caught up with a couple of them, and we sat in being blasted by the wind and everything, drinking our coffee and eating our silk cake.
Well, that was a worthwhile activity to do, I'm sure, and it just reinforces that idea that having a group that responds to your needs and who you can help is important. So, all right, now let's just talk to the future. What are your plans for the future now that you've set yourself this pathway that looks so impressive? But I'm sure you're not sitting still and thinking that's all. And I'd like to hear what you've got planned for the future.
Well, I released a book a couple of years ago called Light Bulb Moments Through the Eyes of Men. So I'm currently working on a book, Light Bulb Moments Through the Eyes of Women. And so I'm hoping to release that this year. I released the podcast in November, and that has the stories of some of the men and women that have spoken at Stories of Hope. But mainly these are stories of people that I interviewed through COVID, because COVID was a time when I became very, very depressed, along with many other Australians, and I actually thought about drinking at 41 years, 40 years sober. So I knew that, it was sink or swim, and I had to start swimming. So I thought what I'll start doing is I'll start interviewing resilient people from around the world. And that was building my hope. And then I started sharing those interviews online to build the hope of other people that were struggling. And I've turned that into a podcast, which was launched last year. And season two's just been launched this week. And that's a very exciting story of an NRL player who's just been signed with the UK Super League. And he shares about his mental health journey and battle with addictions and how his purpose has brought him forward. So a few things in the pipeline, a few exciting collaborations, and that's what's. I don't have the 5 or 6 year plan. I get the plan kind of for about the next year, and I
All
go.
right. Well, that sounds fair enough. No, I want to turn to the question of resilience for a minute, because tomorrow I'm doing a 5-hour session with a whole bunch of luminaries, and we're going to talk about resilience in a personal and a community sense.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what your insights are, having done that work about resilience, not just Australian resilience, but resilience worldwide, perhaps, and any differences that you've seen between us and people from other countries and so on and so forth. Even men and women, of course.
Sure. Yeah. I I've heard this. Actually met a taxi driver when I was in Sydney couple of months ago, and he was from Syria. And we were talking about Australia Day, and he said, "This is the luckiest country in the world." And he said, I think the question came, I said, "Oh, where are you from?" And he said, "I am Australian." And clearly he was from a different country. And I said, "Well, where was your country of birth?" And he said, "Syria." And he said he had the opportunity at the last minute one day to come out here with his family. And he said, um, I jumped at it. And he said, "Every day I wake up and I feel grateful to live in Australia." And it really struck me that he said, people that are born in Australia and live here have no idea how fortunate they are.
Mm.
And he told me about some of the things that he'd been through overseas, and it really made me think, about, gosh, it's so easy to take for granted living here. And I think that some people in different countries just go through things that we could never imagine and we could never understand here. Yeah, so I did have something else I was going to say, and I've lost that train of thought now.
Yeah, but I'm thinking also, because I'm aware I've been to a couple of places where people from the Northern Rivers in New South Wales talk about all the floods they've been through, smashed in 2019, smashed again in 2022, smashed again in 2025. And the point they make is, the first time it happens is a bit of a horrible story.
Yeah.
The second time it happens, you think you're now used to it, but you're not. And then the third time, and I think this gets even harder, is, how do we now cope with this? Because we know what lies ahead in recovery. And that in itself can be limiting on people's mental attitude and the approach to getting things done.
Yeah, something that I have had to continually tell myself in times of great self-doubt and where things look so bleak and so dark is reminding myself of the times and things that I have overcome. sometimes nobody's going to be the person that can give us that strength, and we have to find it from within. And recalling the past times of victory, there's something just so powerful about doing that, because if we know we've done it once, we know we've got it in us to do it again. And so that's something that has really built resilience in me. I think also at times when I've struggled with my own resilience, I've read the stories of other people that have been through really difficult things. And that sometimes sometimes we have to feed ourselves, but we all have a choice at the end of the day. And that is, at some stage, people who have been through trauma have been a victim. But we have the choice whether we remain a victim or whether we dare to take a step out towards becoming a victor. And once we take that step, no matter what that is, whether that's seeking help, finding a purpose, practicing gratitude, determining that things will be different, there's a lot of help out there. And the only way that we find what we look for, and the only way to find that help is to ask.
Okay, Kerrie. Well, I think that's a pretty good place to finish up in this webinar. But I just want to remind people that Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Australia and New Zealand exists to help people who either have post-traumatic stress disorder, live with post-traumatic stress disorder, either at home or with friends or at work, and that we do not provide any support or treatments for people other than providing somebody to talk to. And our shared stories is what keeps us together. I was very impressed, and I'd like people who are on this webinar to think about the past times of victory. I think there's something rather fearless about that idea that when we're having that doubt or we're thinking things aren't going too well, to think back on our past and say, in those circumstances, I was really able to pull myself together and I was able to punch through and achieve a victory over the situation with myself. And I encourage that with people too. Finally, please stay tuned to what's going on with PTSD Australia and New Zealand over the next year. Please come and join our webinars whenever you're able to. I think you'll find them interesting, and I have to acknowledge the work that Belinda Neal does as our webinar manager. She's terrific, puts these things together. And of course, also to thank Tracy Duncan, who actually does the broadcast stuff. And without Tracy's support and help, none of this would happen at all. And so with that, thank you very much, Kerrie. I look forward to our ongoing relationship as we move ahead into the new world. And secondly, I want to thank you all for coming on the webinar and participating tonight. Thanks to all. Bye for now.